Hi, and welcome to World War II. So while we're studying World War II, I thought it would be good to start with some concepts and terms that we're going to have to be using. You may be familiar with some of these already or think you're familiar with some of these. I'm basically going to give you some context for the meaning that I'm going to be applying in the classroom and the way we're going to explore these terms, because like all good social scientists, there is no truth, there is truths. So there are always plural meanings, there are always multiple meanings. So basically this is just to step you through some, get to be thinking about those sorts of terms. So let's start with the League of Nations. They were kind of crucial in the beginning of World War II, and some would argue the cause of World War II. So the League of Nations arose out of World War I. It was an attempt to never have a world war happen again. It was a gathering of a range of nations. It was instigated quite heavily by America, or the United States of America, because America is South America and North America. That's a different conversation. So the USA, but then what was interesting is that the USA never actually joined the League of Nations, and that was actually a part of the problem of the League of Nations. You may have heard of the United Nations. They are what arose out of the League of Nations at the end of World War II, but we'll talk about that when we get to the end of the World War II. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is imperialism. It's argued, and you should have done this in Year 9, that World War I was the end of imperialism. I think that you could argue now that that's actually not the case. It's just that imperialism now comes not through war but through cultural overtake and things like that. But we do need to be familiar with imperialism as a concept, and we need to be conscious of its shift in change in World War II and as a result of World War II. So imperialism now can happen through a range of propaganda techniques, through, as I said, cultural overtake. So people argue that the United States of America is imperialistic because of the way it dominates TV and movie culture and music culture. So you should be familiar with this term. Not going to go into it heavily, but you do need to be aware of it for World War II. The next one I want to talk about is the Great Depression. Again, you're probably familiar with this term. You may have done it in English already because there are books that you read about the Great Depression. It was a period of time globally where there were a lot of people out of work. There was massive economic repercussions. It stems from a 1929 collapse of the stock market in United States of America, which led to the sort of Great Depression. It was an escalating problem. People stopped buying things because they didn't feel like they had enough money. By stop buying things, you slow down the economy because people aren't buying as many things. People don't need to manufacture as many things. And then people don't have money because they're leaving work. So then people stop buying things. And it was kind of this cycle. The other thing is, it's argued that part of the problem with the Great Depression was the government responses to the Great Depression. The way they did spending incentives didn't really work as well as it should have, which extended the duration of the Great Depression. It's kind of really important to know about the Great Depression because, again, this is one of the contributing factors to the start of World War II, in particular because of the way it hit Germany. You may also be aware of the GFC, which occurred in 2008. While that didn't lead us to a Great Depression, it probably should have, and I think some of the economic situations we've got today, or can be argued, are arising of the fact that we didn't let the collapse happen in 2008, so the collapse is still going to come. So just food for thought about Great Depression, it beginning in World War II, it's a cycle thing, it happens again. The next thing I want to talk about is communism. This is a really contentious term. There is much argument about communism. The picture there is Karl Marx, one of the cornerstones of communism. At the end of his life, he declared he was never a Marxist because people were misinterpreting his work so badly. But basically, it's the idea that all property will be held in common. So the means of production will be held by the workers, by everybody. The problem with communism is you do need a dictator to run it. Otherwise it doesn't operate and everything belongs to the government. So there are problems with communism. There have been a few revolutions in relation to communism. You've got the 1917 revolution in Russia, where Lenin then turned into Stalin in the Second World War, and we'll talk a lot about Stalin, or maybe not, depending on what you guys want to talk about. But I quite like learning about Stalin and understanding what happened there. And of course, then you had the 1949 Communist Revolution in China with Mao Zedong. and now basically the most comprehensive communist country we have in the world today would be North Korea. But communism is still around in a range of other countries as well. Okay, I want to talk about nationalism. Why I want to mention nationalism is because there are some arguments about how nationalism worked in World War II and the role it played. We will talk about the Aryan race and the cultural domination that the Germans were going for with that. And the differentiation, the way it's used to differentiate and drive wedges into cultures and into societies. Some people argue that nationalism is bad, some people argue that nationalism is good. You will have heard it a lot today in recent times in relation to Trump and the nationalistic nature of the 2016 campaign and the 2020 campaigns. So we'll be talking about that in class, about is it good, is it bad, what does it actually mean? But fundamentally it just means being a part of your country in most basic terms, but then there is the extreme of, my country is the best and no one else deserves to be alive, which is kind of the extreme way of taking it, but that is a way of taking it. Now I want to talk about fascism. Fascism is a really, really contentious topic, and we're going to be watching a video about that in class because I think this is really, really a heavily misused term. It is actually based in the left ideology. It's actually not based in the right ideology. So there's been a misappropriation of fascism in today's society or alteration of the way it's used. So it has basic principles. So there is an opposition to Marxism, but it's not opposite communism. And we need to be really conscious of the two there. It does like hierarchy, so that's why it's not anti-Marxist, because it does think you should have a social elite and there should be structures in society, and the structure of society they believe should be based on nationalism. So again, we come back to that word there. They don't want parliamentary democracy in fascism. You want to have a dictator, you want to have tyranny, you don't want to have democracy because you don't want people voting, because you don't want them in charge, because that undermines the concept of the ruling elite. They've got an opposition to political and cultural liberalism, because you don't want individuals, you want to have a society united as a nation and nationhood, and all that concepts in relation to that. And it's kind of a totalitarian outcome with fascism. You can't actually have anything, you can't be a successful fascist if you're not totalitarian. Totalitarianism, because you should all know what that means. If you don't, we'll talk about it in class. Really, there's only been two true fascists, and that would be Hitler and Mussolini. And we'll talk about Mussolini and Hitler a lot in class. So now I want to talk about the Allies. Basically, there were two sides in World War II, the Allies and the Axis of Power, which I talk about next. Here you can see England, America, and the Soviet Union. So that's the three gentlemen sitting there. So that was the original Allies. Then there's China. It was also involved in one of the originals, and France, except it got occupied by Germany, so that made it a bit hard to be an ally and fight in the war. Eventually, basically, everyone who was a member of the United Nations, the wartime member of the United Nations, was involved, is a part of the Allies. So there was a fair few of that, including people like Mexico, Iraq, Brazil, Syria, Czechoslovakia, Greece, Guatemala, Poland, and a whole range of people that were involved in that. Oh, and of course Australia. The Third Reich is actually Hitler labelling his entry into power as a third empire. He believed that he was going to lead Germany into its third iteration of an empire. The first one was being the Holy Roman Empire, so a few thousand years ago, and the second one was the German Empire, which was the empire that went before that under Charlemagne in 800. He saw this idea of empire. And so if we come back to imperialism, he was interested in bringing back the imperialist power. So, and being an empire and dominating the world. And this is why it was called the Third Reich. The axis of power. So basically these are the people who weren't in the Allies, and it was Germany, Japan and Italy. And they were, seen as the bad guys in World War II. Of course, it's all about perspective, and there are many truths in the whole process. So they actually made formal pacts, and they actually signed deals So there were other countries involved with the axis of power who aligned themselves with the axis of power, including Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia and Slovakia. So that they were allied there, but they were never, when we talk about the axis of power, we tend to only talk about these three. So it's kind of three people against the rest of the world, and they almost won. So they're terms and concepts that we're going to be talking about a bit. We'll obviously be using a whole range more, but I did want to do these as an introduction to get you guys starting to think about how terms are used, how language is used, and how we use it to structure idea and truths in history.